The scalpel didn't shake in her hand. That was the first thing Dr. Preston Cole noticed, half a second before he understood exactly who he'd spent 4 months mocking. 30 seconds earlier, Elena Reyes had been holding a mop. Have you ever watched someone absorb an insult so completely that you started to wonder if they'd simply stopped feeling them? In the next few minutes, you're going to watch that same person save the life the room's most brilliant, most arrogant doctor couldn't touch, and make him say her name like it actually meant something. Comment where you're watching from. Drop a like, and let's rewind to where this really started. 6 years before that morning, Elena Reyes had been Major Reyes, United States Army, Forward Surgical Team Commander, 2 deployments, 1 Bronze Star with Valor device she never mentioned and rarely thought about. She had opened more chests in the back of moving vehicles than most surgeons open in an operating room in a lifetime. She had learned, in the worst classroom on earth, that the loudest person in a trauma bay is almost never the one keeping the patient alive. Her husband, Marcus, a combat medic, used to tell her that dignity was a discipline, not a mood. Anybody can be calm when nothing's happening, he'd say, cleaning his boots by lamplight in a tent that smelled like diesel and dust. The test is whether you can stay quiet when somebody's trying to make you loud. He said it so often it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like scripture. She believed it the way she believed in tourniquets, not because it was comforting, but because it worked. Marcus didn't come home. He died the way medics often do, not in the dramatic firefight of a movie, but in the unglamorous seconds after one, dragging a wounded private to cover when a secondary device went off under them both. Elena was 200 miles away at the time, elbow deep in someone else's chest cavity, and did not find out until 14 hours later when the surgery she was performing was already over, and the patient was already stable, and there was nothing left to keep her hands busy while the news finally reached her. Neither 3 years later did their daughter Sophia, age 11, admitted to Ashland Memorial with what looked like a routine appendicitis, and was in fact a slowly perforating bowel that a rushed, overconfident second-year resident dismissed twice before it was too late. First as constipation, then 12 hours later as anxiety presenting somatically. A phrase Elena would remember for the rest of her life with a clarity she wished she didn't have. By the time anyone took the pain seriously enough to image it, sepsis had already found its way into Sophia's bloodstream. Elena had not sued. She had not raised her voice in that conference room where the hospital's lawyers sat across from her with practiced, sympathetic faces. She had sat with her hands folded and let them finish. And then she had gone home and taken down her medical license from the wall and put it in a drawer because she no longer trusted her own hands not to do something a surgeon's hands aren't supposed to do to a man who is still technically a colleague. She did not leave medicine because she stopped loving it. She left because she loved it too much to trust herself near it, and because grief, she'd learned, needs somewhere quiet to live. The night she took her license down off the wall, she stood in the kitchen for a long time holding the frame, remembering the day Marcus had hung it there himself, slightly crooked, refusing to let her fix it because, he said, perfect things make people nervous. Let them see you're human. She put it in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet in the garage, under old tax returns, and did not look at it again for 6 years. So she took a job on the environmental services staff at Ashland Memorial, the very hospital that had failed her daughter. Not for the health insurance, though she needed that too, but because some nights she simply needed to be inside a building where people were being saved. Even if she wasn't the one saving them anymore. Her supervisor, hiring her, had glanced at the surgical residency listed years earlier on her old employment history, raised an eyebrow, and asked if that was a typo. Elena had said, "It was a long time ago," in a tone that closed the subject permanently, and it had. She mopped the same floors Sophia had been wheeled across. She restocked supply closets outside the OR where once surgeons had called her doctor. Nobody here called her that. Nobody here knew. She kept her hands sharp anyway. At home, after her shift, she practiced suturing on silicone pads ordered under a fake name so the hospital's supply chain wouldn't flag it. She renewed her ATLS certification online, quietly, every 2 years, telling no one. She read journals in the break room with her jacket zipped over her badge, so no one would ask why a janitor was reading the Journal of Trauma. Twice a year she drove 4 hours to volunteer, unpaid and unlisted, with a rural surgical outreach group that didn't check resumes, just hands. Her hands never forgot. Dr. Preston Cole arrived at Ashland Memorial the January Elena turned 44, hired away from a prestigious residency program with a reputation for brilliance that traveled ahead of him like weather. He was, by every technical measure, an excellent surgeon, fast, precise, occasionally inspired. He was also, from his first week, a man who had never once in his life been made to feel small, and who had therefore never developed the muscle for treating people who couldn't advance his career. He didn't learn the names of the environmental services staff. He called them housekeeping, the way some men say sweetheart, a word meant to put a whole category of person in their place. When Elena wheeled her cart past the nurse's station one morning and quietly mentioned, to no one in particular, but loud enough for the charge nurse to hear, that a patient's IV line looked like it had infiltrated Cole, turned around and said in front of 6 people, "Did the mop tell you that, or did you read it off a soap opera?" The nurses laughed, the tight, uncomfortable laugh of people who need their jobs. Elena finished emptying the trash bin and moved to the next room. She did not answer. Marcus's voice, 12 years dead, said it for her. The test is whether you can stay quiet. It went on for months in smaller ways than that. The chart he let slip out of his hands and didn't pick up because that's what she's for. The meeting he talked over her in without knowing she'd once run meetings where the stakes were somebody's femoral artery. The afternoon he told a resident loud enough for the whole supply corridor to hear, "The nice thing about talking to housekeeping is you never have to worry they'll disagree with your diagnosis." He laughed at his own joke. Nobody else did, but nobody stopped him either. At the holiday party that December, 3 drinks into an open bar the hospital foundation had paid for, Cole found himself cornered by a junior orthopedic resident, and, in the particular mood of a man who believes himself among admirers, let his guard all the way down. "You know what nobody tells you about a place like this," he said, swirling his glass, "is that half the staff couldn't get into a community college, let alone med school. The janitor who's always hovering by the nurse's station, sweet woman I'm sure, but she looks at a chart like it's written in Latin. It's actually kind of restful, working around people who will never once tell you you're wrong." He didn't notice Elena in the hallway behind him, waiting for the ice machine, close enough to hear every word, her face arranged in the same unreadable calm it had worn for 4 months. She refilled her cup and walked away before he turned around. Marcus's voice again, patient as ever. "Anybody can be calm when nothing's happening. Only one person at Ashland Memorial knew who Elena Reyes really was, Dr. Adiz Akafor, the hospital's chief medical officer, who had trained alongside Elena a decade earlier and recognized her the day she was hired into environmental services, and who had never once betrayed the secret because Elena had asked her not to. "When you're ready," Akafor told her once in a stairwell quietly, "your file's still open with the state board. I made sure of that. It doesn't expire if I keep renewing it." Elena had thanked her and said nothing more. She was not ready. She did not know if she would ever be ready. But she had not closed the door, either, and some nights, driving home past the hospital's lit windows, she wondered if some part of her had simply been waiting to be needed badly enough that the fear didn't get a vote. The morning it happened, a delivery truck lost its brakes on the overpass above Route 9 and came down through the guardrail into 4 lanes of stopped commuter traffic. Ashland Memorial's ER, a level II trauma center that saw maybe 1 mass casualty call a year, got 11 patients in 14 minutes. Cole was running the bay, and to his credit, he was good, until the 9th patient came in. A 9-year-old boy named Theo Alvarez with a crushed chest, blood pressure, crashing, requiring an emergency thoracotomy that Cole, for all his fast hands, had performed exactly twice in his career, and never on a child. Never under this kind of pressure, never with a room this loud and a mother screaming in the hallway and a resident shaking so hard he dropped a clamp. Cole's hands, for the first time anyone at Ashland Memorial had ever seen, hesitated. Just half a second. But half a second in that room was a lifetime. "I need a right thoracotomy tray, and I need it now," Cole said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that made the whole trauma bay go colder than the air conditioning already had it. Elena Reyes was in the hallway with her cart, close enough to see the monitor through the open door, close enough to hear the numbers falling. She had heard those numbers fall before, in the back of a Black Hawk over Kandahar province, with worse light and worse tools, and a boy not much older than Theo Alvarez. Her body moved before her mind finished deciding, the way it always had, the way Marcus used to say hands remember what minds are too afraid to. "Move," she said, and it was the first time in 4 months anyone had heard her raise her voice above a murmur, and it cut through that room like a scalpel through skin. "I've done this. Give me the tray." Cole turned, disbelieving, furious at the interruption, and froze, the way a man freezes when the ground he's standing on turns out not to be the ground he thought it was. Because Elena Reyes had already scrubbed in with a speed, and a certainty that no janitor on Earth possesses, had already made the incision along the 5th intercostal space, with a hand that had done this exact motion, this exact cut. More times than Preston Cole had performed surgery of any kind, and was already reaching into Theo Alvarez's chest to relieve the pressure crushing his heart, calling out vitals and next steps in the flat, unhurried cadence of someone who had learned under fire. "That panic is a luxury the patient can't afford. Cross-clamp," she said. "Someone get me suction, and somebody find out this kid's blood type before I ask twice." Nobody asked who she was. Nobody had time. Her gloved hands moved with a fluency that made the resident beside her forget briefly to be afraid, retracting, packing, her eyes fixed on the boy's chest with the total, unblinking focus of someone who had long ago stopped being able to see anything else in a moment like this. When the bleeding pooled faster than expected, she didn't flinch or raise her voice. She simply said, "There it is," the way a person might note that it had started to rain, and adjusted her grip half an inch to the left. For the next 11 minutes, Elena Reyes did the thing she had built her entire life around and then buried, in front of a room full of people who had called her housekeeping, while the boy's mother sobbed against the hallway wall and Dr. Adiz Akafer, alerted by a resident's frantic page, arrived in the doorway and simply stood there, hand over her mouth, watching her friend come back to life in real time. When the bleeding was controlled and Theo Alvarez's pressure began slowly to climb back toward something survivable, Elena stepped back from the table, and the room exhaled all at once, and Preston Cole, pale, sweating, his own hands still faintly trembling, looked at the woman in the housekeeping polo shirt with surgical gloves pulled over it, and said the only thing his mind could produce. "Who are you?" It was Dr. Akafer who answered from the doorway, her voice unsteady with something between pride and 12 years of kept silence. "That," she said, "is Major Elena Reyes, forward surgical team, 2 combat deployments, Bronze Star. She has more chest surgeries in field conditions than you have in an operating room, Dr. Cole, and she has been emptying your trash can for 4 months while you called her the mop." The color that left Preston Cole's face did not fully return that day. What came after was not dramatic in the way Cole's humiliation had been public. It was worse, in the way that consequences delivered by institutions instead of by fists always are. The state board review triggered by the incident, standard procedure, whenever a non-privileged staff member performs an emergency surgical intervention, didn't just examine what Elena had done. It examined why a trauma chief had frozen on a routine complexity thoracotomy, and that question led investigators to 2 prior incidents Cole had quietly settled and buried in his previous hospital's confidential files, cases where his overconfidence had cost patients dearly, and his connections had cost him nothing. One involved a woman left partially paralyzed after a rushed spinal decompression. The other, a settlement so tightly sealed that even the hospital's own credentialing committee hadn't been told the full details when they hired him. Ashland Memorial's board suspended his privileges within the month, and the state medical board opened its own file soon after. He did not return, and the residents who once laughed nervously at his jokes stopped mentioning his name at all. Theo Alvarez spent 11 days in the pediatric ICU and walked out of Ashland Memorial on his own legs, one hand wrapped around his mother's, the other clutching a card the trauma bay staff had signed. Elena's signature small and steady near the bottom. Elena's own board review went the opposite direction. Dr. Akefer's years of quietly renewed paperwork meant reinstatement took weeks, not years, a formality, in the end, rather than a fight. Theo's parents, when they learned who had saved their son, established a scholarship in her name at the same rural outreach program. She'd been volunteering with in secret, full surgical training funding for one nurse or medic a year who couldn't otherwise afford it. Elena asked that it carry Marcus's name instead of hers. They agreed. She did not ask for Cole's old office. She asked instead to split her time between the trauma bay and the outreach program, and the hospital board, chastened and grateful in equal measure, said yes to whatever she wanted. The Tuesday evening after her reinstatement, Elena climbed to the small rooftop garden above the west wing. 6 raised beds she had planted 18 months earlier, and told everyone was just something to keep the maintenance staff busy. Though it was really the spot closest to the window of the room where Sophia had died, the only garden in the city she could stand to tend. Dr. Akefer found her there with 2 paper cups of hospital cafeteria hot chocolate, the good kind with the little marshmallows, and sat down on the low concrete wall beside her without asking permission, the way old friends do. "You could have told them sooner," Akefer said. "I wasn't ready sooner," Elena said. "I don't think I even knew I was ready today. Theo just needed someone, and I stopped asking myself whether I was allowed to be that someone." They sat for a while without talking, looking out over a parking lot going gold in the last of the light 2 cups of cheap hot chocolate steaming between them, and somewhere below a hospital kept doing what hospitals do, quietly at 3 in the morning, without anyone watching, saving whoever it could. The moral of this one isn't complicated, and it isn't really about titles or uniforms. It's that the quietest person in the room is very often the one who has already survived the thing everyone else is afraid of, and that dignity, real dignity, doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up every day with a mop or a scalpel, whichever the moment actually needs. The people who make you feel small rarely know what you've already carried. Don't let them convince you it isn't there. Have you ever watched someone let an insult roll off them because they already knew who they were? Now you've watched what happens when the room finally catches up to the truth. Comment where you're watching from, drop a like, and we'll see you in the next one.